Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video.
Hi, welcome to our Wednesday Zoom classes from Virginia Cooperative Extension. I'm Nancy Berlin, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Kathy Westcott. She's a VCE-Prince William Master Gardener Volunteer, and we'll be talking with you about bulbs in the garden.
Good morning, I'm Kathy Westcott. This morning we're going to take a look at some flowering bulbs. Why do we grow bulbs? They look great together. They're brightly colored, relatively inexpensive, and many will come back the following year. But I think the best reason, after a dreary winter, they're always a joy to see. What is a bulb? It's actually an underground storage unit that provides energy for the plant to grow and bloom. Here in Northern Virginia, we're in Agricultural Zone 7A. Some bulbs are hardy here and can survive our winters just fine. Some bulbs are tender and need to be dug up in the fall and stored until spring. Bulb is a general term. It's applied to describe true bulbs, rhizomes, corms, tubers, and fleshy roots. True bulbs have many compressed leaves in the bulb. If this looks like an onion, that's because an onion is a true bulb. It's made up of these compressed leaves that store the carbohydrates. There's an immature flower inside. 3 examples of the bulbs of true bulbs are daffodils, lilies, and tulips. Here's a closer look at a tulip bulb. The outer layer is called a tunic. It's a papery covering. It helps keep the bulb from drying out. Inside you'll see the developing bud. The scales are modified leaves that store the food necessary for the bulb to grow. The basal plate at the bottom connects the roots to the rest of the bulb. The roots grow from the basal plate and take up the water and nutrients needed for the plant to grow. Here are examples of flowers that grow from true bulbs. The narcissus family includes daffodils, jonquils, and narcissus. They originated in North Africa and Spain, but spread easily all across Europe. The Dutch hyacinth originated in the Middle East. Lilies come from many different locations, including Japan, and especially from South Africa. Scilla is a native of Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean. Here's a look at some different narcissus. They are generally white and yellow, but newer varieties may also have pink, green, and orange. Narcissus are named after the handsome youth in Greek mythology who looked at his reflection in the river and fell in love with his own image. The hyacinth is a much smaller family of plants. It's also named after a man in Greek mythology who died when he was hit in the head by a discus. The myth claims the flower sprouted from his blood. Here we see the Dutch iris on the left, muscari or grape hyacinth in the middle, and mountain hyacinth on the right. Tulips come in a huge variety of shapes, as you can see here. The word tulip is Turkish for turban. They originated in the Middle East from Turkey to the border of China. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire planted them in his gardens and later gave them to a visiting diplomat, which is how they ended up in the Netherlands. Lilies come in many sizes and colors. Asiatic lilies bloom in June and July. They're closely followed by the Oriental lilies. Resurrection lilies send up strappy leaves in the spring, which then die back. In August, the flowers suddenly appear. Some people call them surprise lilies or naked ladies because they have no leaves. Corm is a swollen stem. It includes gladiolus, crocus, and ranunculus. Sometimes they're fairly smooth, like the one you see here. Sometimes they're extremely wrinkled. These are crocus corms. You'll notice on the bottom is an old corm. It's depleted from this year's growth. 1 or 2 new corms will grow on the top. Also notice the little cormlet. It's too small to bloom now, but will eventually. These are examples of flowers that are grown from corms. The cyclamen is borderline hardy here in Northern Virginia. It's usually grown indoors as a house plant. This is another plant that came from the Middle East. Crocus we think of as just being a spring bloomer, but there are also fall blooming varieties. The Crocus sativus is the source of the spice saffron, and it blooms in the fall. Gladiolus comes from the Latin word for sword. It's sometimes called a sword lily. It will bloom in midsummer. Crocosmia is a late summer bloomer and originated in the grasslands of South Africa. There's a tuber. Obviously, this is a potato, probably the tuber most familiar to us. If you cut off a piece of a tuber, as long as there's an eye on it, it will grow into a new plant. Dahlias and tuberous begonias grow from tubers. Here's some pictures of these flowers, plus the Japanese anemones and anemones, also called windflowers. These flowers grow from fleshy roots. They have regular-looking roots, but some of them are swollen where food is stored, so they are included here. The rhizomes are thickened stems that grow partially or entirely underground. The rhizome only grows in one direction. Canna lilies and bearded iris and lily of the valley all grow and spread by rhizomes. There's many types of irises, and they come in lots of colors and sizes. Some grow from bulbs and others from rhizomes. These also originated in the Middle East and grew wild throughout Syria. The name Iris means rainbow in Greek. In Greek mythology, the goddess Iris descended to earth on a rainbow. The French king Clovis was enamored with the flower, and he adopted the iris as his emblem. That emblem is the fleur-de-lis that you see today. It symbolizes everything French. Here are some more irises. Some prefer quite wet conditions and do well along ponds. Most of the bulbs that we get are imported from the Netherlands, and they're inspected by the Department of Agriculture to make sure they're disease and pest-free. There are bulbs for every application. They can be naturalized, grown in containers, in rock gardens, and in cutting gardens, and some can be forced out of season to bloom. So how did the Netherlands in Northern Europe become the epicenter of the flower bulb industry? I mentioned before that a diplomat from the Ottoman Empire gave bulbs to a botanist in Austria by the name of Carolus Clusius. He was researching medicinal plants, and he took the bulbs that he got back to the Netherlands, to the town of Leiden, where he planted them. Through experimentation, he developed new varieties and colors. The Dutch went absolutely crazy over tulips, and by the 1630s, their economy was largely dependent on the sale of tulip bulbs. This period was called tulip mania. Clusius is considered the father of the bulb industry. Now, the tulips you see on the right are shaped more like the original tulips from the Middle East would have been. And if you go to your garden center this fall and you look for tulips shaped like this, look for the botanical name, and you'll see that they're called Clusiana tulips. When you're purchasing bulbs, remember that it's a food storage organ. So you want to buy large bulbs. The larger bulbs will give you a better plant. Small bulbs might not even bloom the first year. Bulbs are often sold by their circumference size, and so the bigger the bulb, the more it may cost you. Avoid bulbs with root plate damage. This may result in poor root growth. Avoid moldy or shriveled bulbs. You want the bulbs to be firm. Don't buy bulbs that are soft or sour smelling, as they could be diseased. And take care to not damage the tunic, as this keeps your bulbs from drying out. There are lots of places to purchase bulbs. Check out mail order catalogs, garden centers, and home improvement stores. Sometimes you'll get a better price if you buy them in quantity. And while it's tempting to wait for sales, you may not get the best quality bulbs. When planting bulbs, the rule of thumb is to plant them at a depth 2 to 3 times the height of the bulb. Tender bulbs and corms can be planted closer to the surface of the soil, and iris rhizomes are buried half in and half out of the soil. You'll want to mix a slow-release, high-phosphate fertilizer under the bulbs, or many people use bone meal for this. Most bulbs need well-drained soil so they don't rot. They'll need to be protected from wildlife. You can purchase cages to protect the bulbs, and you can cover the ground with chicken wire to deter digging animals. There are commercial sprays that work well to keep wildlife from eating the leaves and flowers. Bulbs grow best in soil that's rich in organic matter, but are quite tolerant of poorer soils. Most bulbs require at least 6 hours of sun. Here's some bulbs that are critter resistant. Of course, deer, if they're hungry enough, will try anything. Some bulbs are toxic to humans or pets. Lilies are especially poisonous to cats and can cause kidney failure and death. If you have a cat that likes to nibble on your plants, I'd recommend you not bring cut lilies into your house. To maintain your bulbs, you should fertilize them with a complete fertilizer, such as 5-10-5, right after the bulbs bloom. In the fall, you can fertilize them with phosphate, if you can find them. Always let the foliage die back naturally on your bulbs. Don't braid it or twist it up with a rubber band. This interferes with the plant's ability to absorb water and nutrients and to rebuild the bulb for next year's growth. When the foliage is yellow, you can remove it. If you plan to divide or move your bulbs, you may need to mark the soil where you've planted them, because once the foil dies back, you won't find them again. Some bulbs should be divided regularly, about every 3 to 5 years. Tulips and hyacinths don't rebloom well here in Virginia, so they should be replaced every year. It's best to dig and divide and transplant bulbs when they're dormant. This is usually late June or July for your spring blooming bulbs. Here's an iris rhizome. They should be lifted and divided about every 3 years to renew the vigor of the plant. In Virginia, this means late June or July, after they've gone dormant. Dig the rhizome and clean off the dirt. Inspect it for rot or for iris borers, and discard ones that don't look healthy. You can cut the rhizome into pieces a few inches long and let them sit in the sun for a day or two. Then cut the foliage back to about 5 inches and replant them half buried in well-drained soil. Don't cover them with mulch. They'll do best if exposed to the heat and sun. Here again are the corms. You can see the old corm on the bottom and the new corm on the top. It's not necessary to divide them, but you can if you want to move them around and have more flowers. This is what your corm might look like if you were to dig them up. You can see on the left, the gladiolus has lots of cormlets. On the right, you can see the old crocus corm on the bottom and the new corms on top. You can store bulbs temporarily at 60 to 65 degrees. Don't store them in the garage because exhaust fumes can damage them. If you didn't get around to planting your bulbs in the fall, they will not bloom if you plant them in the spring. Store bulbs in pots with slightly moist peat moss or in paper bags with wood shavings or vermiculite. Tender bulbs, such as dahlias and cannas, must be dug in the fall and stored over the winter. You're going to dig them up after the foliage turns yellow and let the bulbs dry off after you've rinsed the soil off. Store them in paper bags or loose peat moss. They prefer 55 degrees to 65 degrees and low humidity. You'll need to check them occasionally over the winter because bulbs become moldy or dry out. Many people like to force bulbs. This is popular at Christmas time or to get them to bloom during the winter. You can plant your bulbs in pots, in shallow bowls, or in special containers which suspend the bulbs over the water, such as these hyacinth jars you see shown here on the windowsill. In the pots and bowls, you can use soil, pea gravel, or marbles. On the right, you'll see the narcissus are planted in soil, but they're only buried halfway. If you're forcing a bulb, most of them are going to need to be placed in complete darkness and temperatures of 35 to 48 degrees for 12 to 16 weeks in order to get them to bloom. An exception to this are paper white narcissus and amaryllis. They don't need chilling, and that makes them popular for forcing. One of the problems with growing paper whites is they tend to get so tall they fall over. Some researchers at Cornell University discovered that you can stunt their growth by about 1/3 if you start to water them with a mixture of water and alcohol. After the bulbs sprout 1 or 2 inches, pour off all the water and replace it with a 4 to 6% alcohol solution made from any hard liquor. If your gin or vodka is 40% alcohol, to get a 5% solution, you need 1 part alcohol to 7 parts water. If you only have 70% rubbing alcohol, you'll need 1 part alcohol to 10 or 11 parts of water. Anything stronger will damage the plant. Don't use beer or wine because they contain too much sugar. If you can't pour off the water, you can simply start irrigating the plant with the alcohol solution, but it won't be quite as effective as if you had poured off the water. Like I said, this will stunt the plant by about 1/3. Let's take a look at the most common hardy bulbs. Your daffodil is a favorite in the spring. They do best in full sun, but will bloom in dappled shade, but maybe not as prolifically. Plant them in the fall. They naturalize well in fields and other open spaces, and deer will leave them alone because every part of the plant, especially the bulb, is toxic. Gladiolas do best in strong sunlight and well-drained soil. This is a summer bloomer, so you plant this one in the spring. If you stagger your planting by 2 weeks, you'll get a longer show of blooms. These are hardy in zone 7 south. They're kind of borderline hardy here, so you may need to protect them by mulching them in the winter, but remove the mulch as soon as they start to grow in the spring. Irises need full sun and moist soil. They bloom in late May and June, although some of the new varieties will rebloom in the fall, and their rhizomes sit partially above the soil. These will be planted in the fall. Lilies are planted in full sun. You can plant them in either the fall or the spring. These are like candy to deer. You'll need to spray them regularly to keep them away. Plant your tulips in full sun in the fall. They may repeat bloom the next year, but they're not reliable, so most people plant new bulbs every year. You can protect them from grazing deer and squirrels by covering them with chicken wire, or you can spray them with a deer repellent spray. Plant your crocus in full sun in well-drained soil. Spring blooming crocus must be planted in the fall. Fall blooming varieties are planted in the spring. These are one of the earliest flowers to bloom, and they do well under trees and even in the lawn. Alliums are in the onion family, so deer leave them alone. You're going to plant these in full sun in well-drained soil. They bloom in mid-spring and are mostly purple, pink, or white. Deer leave them alone. The flowers come in different size globes from 2 inches to 12 inches, and when the flowers dry, they look like starbursts. Plant them in groups, and the dried flowers will add interest to your garden for the rest of the year. Fritillaria need to be planted in full sun and will bloom in the late spring and the summer. Plant them in the fall. These smell bad, so wildlife tend to leave them alone. Muscari, or grape hyacinths, these are short plants. Flowers are about 4 inches high, and they come in shades of blue, pink, and white. You can plant these in the fall, in full sun. The leaves will come up in the fall, and then the flowers will emerge the following spring. They spread rapidly and are virtually pest-proof. Hyacinths need full sun and dry soil. They're early spring bloomers and very fragrant, and some people like to force them. Plant these in the fall also. Like tulips, they're not reliable rebloomers, and most people replant them every year. Let's take a look at some tender bulbs. Amaryllis are popular at Christmas time. If you grow them outside, they'll bloom in August, but they must be brought in and stored over the winter. When you plant them, you're going to leave the top quarter of the bulb exposed. Caladiums are grown mainly for their foliage. They combine well with impatiens and other annuals, and they do very well in pots. You can plant them in full sun to partial shade. You can start the tubers inside and then transplant them outside once they leaf out. Canna lilies come in many sizes and colors. You're going to grow them in rich soil in full sun. plant them in the spring, and store the bulbs over the winter. That's all the slides we have for today. We hope you've enjoyed them. We have time for a few questions.
So someone had a question about trimming foliage on daffodils, which is answered in the chat. You really don't want to do that. You want to make sure that the daffodils are able to use as much of that energy as they possibly can. When they start to brown over and die back, those nutrients get recycled. So it's probably not a good idea to be trimming foliage on any of your bulbs. When do you plant dahlias?
This is Linda. You plant them after danger of frost.
What bulbs are vole resistant? I would argue none of them. If they can get to it, they will go after it. Rodents are particularly fond of bulbs. There's not really a whole lot you can do except try and control your vole population, which means getting rid of things like brush piles or thick mulch, places for them to hide over the winter. Are there any native bulbs? Probably. Most of the bulbs that we grow are plants that are more showy and have been imported. Can't think off the top of my head of any native bulbs.
Well, there are some native lilies, so I'm assuming those are bulbs.
The trout lily is native. I'm not sure if it's a bulb or corm or what, but it comes up each year.
We'll have to look into that and see if there are others.
Native bulbs and spring ephemerals, bloodroot, trillium, bleeding hearts, Dutchman's breeches.
Oh yeah, I forgot completely about bleeding hearts. Yeah, bleeding heart is a native, and in the wild variety, it's a white and yellow instead of pink. Do you really need to bring in the CC Anna every year?
If you have a mild winter, I did not bring my cannas in last year just because I got lazy, but it was mild and they survived, but I wouldn't count on it.
My dahlias are 6 feet tall with few buds. How can I increase the buds? Could be a couple of things. It could be a soil issue where there's not enough phosphorus, because phosphorus is important in flowering. They just might not be happy. If it's a chronic thing, that might be a little different, but if it's just this year, it might be a nutritional issue, or it may just be that the dahlias weren't really happy with the weather as it panned out this year with the heavy drought and heat and then lots of rain. Basically, if you want more flowers on any flowering plant, you really need to keep it sexually frustrated. And, you know, if you start killing or clipping flowers before they are able to set seed, then the plant is going to want to put out more flowers and try and set more seed. That's really the way that you would deal with that. How much sun do irises need? It really depends on the iris. I've seen irises growing in shade. I've seen them growing in full sun. I think most irises prefer full sun, but there are some that have some shade tolerance to them. The more sun they have, typically the better. How do I prep my backyard for planting wildlife seeds? And should I topsoil the backyard, then plant? First of all, I would add compost rather than topsoil, because the topsoil you get can be hit or miss as to how good it is. Compost will feed the beneficial microbes in the soil, and that will help your plant be happier and healthier. If you're planting wildflower seeds, part of it depends on what type of plant it is, but generally speaking, it's really important to have that seed to soil contact. So scratching up the surface of the soil is a good idea. If you've got a big bare area, maybe a little bit of tillage and work in the compost, and then pack the seed down because it needs to be in firm contact. How do you plant ranunculus to avoid foliage emerging then rotting? Never really had that problem. You may have a disease issue there. Could be the source that you're getting something that's got a disease to start with, or it could be that it's the wrong place for that plant. You might try it in a different area and see if that's the problem. Squirrels dig up every bulb I plant. How can I prevent this? Squirrels are really difficult to deal with. You can lay down chicken wire over the winter over the area where you have planted bulbs, but then you need to be vigilant in the spring when it starts to warm up and get that chicken wire up so those bulbs have the opportunity to grow, and don't get some of our some of the stalks of some of our bulbs get thick enough where having chicken wire over it might cause a problem. What do you spray to keep deer away? Is there an option that is organic / not a pesticide? Deer are kind of funny. Sometimes they will eat even things they're, quote, not supposed to, like members of the onion family, and sometimes they don't eat things that other deer really like. I know at our teaching garden, we typically use Bob-X, but there are other deer repellents. Most of these are based on smelling really badly, which in some cases defeats the purpose of having your bulbs and flowers for you to enjoy. But the problem with the sprays to keep the deer away is run into an issue of every time there's a rain, you're going to have to reapply it. Sometimes exclusion is a better option if you can fence things off. They make netting that you have probably seen at some of the shopping centers where you can put that over your flowering bulbs, and that keeps the deer from nibbling at them. Blends in well enough that at least from a distance, you don't really see the net. Can grape hyacinth survive winter here in pots? That depends on where here is. Assuming that we're talking about Prince William County, I haven't tried them in pots. They certainly will survive in the ground, but you do need to have a big deep pot, because remember that with pots, they will freeze quicker than anything in the ground because they don't have that extra insulation of all the soil. So I would say probably you're best off, if you're going to try it in a pot, to make sure it's a big pot. The other thing you can do is have the pot close to the house, and some of the radiant heat from the house will help keep the soil a little bit warmer than it otherwise would be. How do you divide bulbs, and when is the best time to do that? It depends on the bulb. It's really a matter of noticing when they're starting to get thick. Typically, if you've got a planting of bulbs and they're starting to get thick and crowded, that's probably a good time to start, after they have flowered and they've died back. That would be a good time to dig them up, look to see what bulbs you can divide those, and then replant those. Is Jack in the Pulpit native? Yes. What can I plant on top of daffodils after they've blossomed? It really depends on what you're going for. If you're talking about an annual, there's some shallow-rooted annuals that you can use. If you're talking about perennials, you just have to be a little bit careful. You want something that's got more fibrous roots rather than thick roots to make sure that there's room for them to come up. And you also want something that you can plant shallow enough where you're not messing with the bulb as you dig to plant those in. Theoretically, you can put turf over daffodils. You see this in Europe quite a bit, where they plant bulbs for the spring and the bulbs come up and flower. And about the time that the foliage has died back on those bulbs, they're ready for their first mowing, and so it doesn't hurt the bulbs. But with daffodils in our climate, daffodils take a lot of time before that happens. So I wouldn't use turf with daffodils, but things like crocus would work with that. Sometimes it's just easier to mulch on top of daffodils. Next question is about storing bulbs. Is quite a process. Can you pinpoint the ones with low maintenance that are left in the ground? Usually crocus are easy to leave in the ground. Any of the bulbs you can leave in the ground, really. It's just a matter of what their survival is going to be. Linda, do you know of any lower maintenance bulbs? Off the top of my head, I'm not really thinking of anyone because I always leave my bulbs in the ground. And grape hyacinth is the only one I can really think of, and lily of the valley.
Well, iris, if you're talking about that, it's not specifically a bulb, but iris comes back year after year, and you do have to divide it about every 3 years, but other than that, it's fairly low maintenance.
Bleeding heart generally will come back as well.
Oh, yeah. I don't know why I keep forgetting about bleeding heart. It's one of my favorite little flowers in the spring. But if you're moving on towards irises, which are rhizobia, they're a lot more hardy in terms of not having to dig them up. The speaker said to let the leaves post-bloom die naturally. That is true. That's what you want to do to make sure that they can get as much energy as possible, so that they will be able to store as much energy for the next coming year. When do you plant?
Springtime. They're spring ones also.
Someone made a comment that Milorganite fertilizer helps keep deer from eating plants. That is true. Milorganite has a smell to it that deer particularly don't like. The problem with using Milorganite is that sometimes, again, after rain, that Milorganite can get incorporated into the soil and it's not as effective. The other issue with Milorganite is you really want to think about, do you need to be adding that fertilizer depending on what your soil is like. Milorganite has some phosphorus and it has some nitrogen, but it doesn't have potassium, which your plants may need depending on your soil test. Someone mentioned that their caladiums took forever to sprout. I was asking about a heat mat and what's the time frame for them to be planted outside. I'm in zone 5A. I'm not really sure about 5A. My best answer for that is I would talk to your local extension office. They would have a better time frame for you to be able to plant and could speak more about methods that are better for your particular zone. Someone mentioned that they've used Irish Spring soap shavings to deter deer. I've heard that as well. I've not seen any science on that, but I've heard anecdotal. And again, really with deer, a lot of times you're creating smells that they don't like, and that will repel them. But you do have to be vigilant, and you do have to redo them from time to time.
I was going to say, Thomas, if I could interject. If you go to our YouTube channel, we have a video called Dealing with Deer, in which Leslie Paulson really covers a lot of different things that you can do to prevent deer from eating all kinds of plants, not just your bulbs.
Can you recommend bulbs for shadier locations? I would have to research that. Other than Bleeding Heart is the one, bluebells. Bleeding Heart and bluebells, those would be good for shade. If you email our help desk, mastergardener@pwcgov.org, we can look that up and get it to you. When you plant bulbs in the fall, do you need to keep the surface clear of fallen leaves? Not necessarily. I mean, if you don't want to keep them super heavy, you want there to be a little bit of leaves to break down and add some nutrients. But if you've got a normal layer of leaves, they're going to be decomposing and they're not going to really be a problem for the bulbs. If it's a super thick layer, the bulbs may have a little bit of trouble getting out, but normally that's not really a problem. When do you plant onions in the fall? Garlic, I know, late September, early October. Onions, you want them to have some heft to them before you hit into winter. And usually with new onion starts, you probably want to make sure that they have a little bit of mulch on top of them to keep them a little bit warmer. If I'm going to plant onions in the fall, it's usually going to be kind of early fall to make sure that they can get some energy to put into roots. And then over the winter, they'll be able to put down more roots and pop back up in the spring. I have red beetles on my lilies for the past 3 years, and I'm having trouble getting rid of them. Should I pull them out and start over? Not knowing what that red beetle is, it's hard to say. If you happen to be able to send us a picture of what that beetle is, we can look it up and give you some control recommendations, whether it's a chemical or whether it's something cultural. Someone's asking, when do I need to cover my pots? If you're growing things in the pots, you need to be really careful about frosts and freezes as we go into late fall and winter. You want to make sure that if there's an upcoming frost or freeze that you're insulating your pots beforehand. Rose plant that has leaves eaten, how do you prevent leaves from getting eaten, or is it a plant disease? Not being able to see the plant, I couldn't tell you one way or the other. Again, pictures would be helpful. If you send those, we can research it. I will tell you that this is an awful place to grow roses. The best places to grow roses are in arid conditions. We get a lot of fungal pressure here, and so it could be a fungal issue that's causing it, or it could be that some animal, probably deer, happens to like your rose leaves. So I'm looking for bulbs in partially shaded area that includes pine tree. How does the acidity from the pine impact the bulb? Basically, you've got to do your research and look for bulbs that evolved in conditions that are similar to the plants that you have. Most of our soils here in Virginia naturally are somewhere between 4.5 and 5.5 pH, and that's particular to forested areas, which that's the way this part of the country evolved. We used to be one big forest. So it really kind of depends. Now, I would do a soil test first and see what your pH is. If your pH is a little higher in the 6s, that's probably fine for most bulbs. If it's in that 5, 5.5 range or even lower, then you want to do a little research and see what bulbs work best there. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any that really don't like acidity or really do like acidity. If you send us a note at the help desk, we'll be able to research that and get back to you. Do deer eat bleeding hearts?
Yes.
I was going to say I'm not. It depends on what else they have to eat, I would say, because I've been in places in the Shenandoah where there's bleeding hearts everywhere with no deer damage. In more suburban urban areas where there's more deer pressure and not as much to eat, bleeding hearts are certainly on the menu.
I had bleeding heart and lots of deer in a previous home, and they tended to ignore it, but Linda's right. Basically, they will eat anything. So you have to decide, will you take a chance? I took a chance and mine survived.
So another question is how best to insulate pots. Depends on the pot, quite honestly. Sometimes you can wrap them. You can get from horticultural supply places, there are weatherproof, basically blankets that you can wrap around them, wrap over them. In some cases, you can bury them in straw, put them close by the house, especially if you've got a brick wall, so that radiant heat will help with that. When do I need to bring Datura in? It really depends. I know that they probably cannot handle freezing ground temperatures. Anything that I need to bring in for the winter, I would do it before the first frost. Is there a rule of thumb for bulb spacing? Oh, for spacing garlic. Typically, when we plant garlic in our demonstration garden, I want to think we're looking at about 6 to 8 inches apart. You can grow them a little bit tighter, but the bulbs tend not to be as big. The more space you give them, the better off they'll do. Thanks, Jen. Datura is tolerant in zones 8 to 11, so anything, if you're in 7 or 6 or 5, you want to bring those inside. Well, thank you all for attending. Our next week we're not having class because of the holiday. Our following class is going to be on fall vegetables. If you have other questions, either that we didn't get to or that you think of in the future, please let us know. Use that mastergardener@pwcgov.org email to get us those questions, and we'd be happy to answer them for you. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time.